Hello and welcome to Bozanko Studios for History 1378, lecture number 9. So we're making headway here well into the 1920s, the Depression. Soon we'll be talking about World War II. So I hope you're staying on top of things. I open every one of these by saying the same thing, do all the reading. It's really important because, a lot of times I go over stuff fairly quickly or briefly, and the readings are way better in that regard. They're more detailed, they're more comprehensive. Stay on top of things, check the syllabus if you have any questions. Go to Blackboard, where most of the information you need is going to be available. If you have any questions, check in with the TAs if they're about the test or extra credit. But again, most of that is going to be on Blackboard anyway. If you have issues with the books, contact Nunn McGinty. And if you have any content questions or anything like that, check in with the TAs or me anytime you need to. But make sure you look at the syllabus and Blackboard first, because quite often the questions that the TAs get are already there if you just look for them. So I hope it's going well, and let's get going. The last time we talked a little bit about the Depression, how bad it was, what caused it, various causes of the Depression, and made a lot of connections between the economy in the late 1920s and 1930s and stuff that's actually going on today. Some of these economic ideas, these economic conditions tend to be kind of universal when it comes to economic problems. And so what you see happening in the 1920s and 30s, and the economy in the 1920s and 30s is really very, very different than the economy today. But a lot of the conditions, are often, very similar. The idea of surplus capital, people speculating in the stock market. Obviously, there's a great gap between people who are wealthy and people who are poor. So that leads to extreme poverty, banking crises, problems getting credit for poor people. So all that kind of stuff is kind of universal. And you'll see it pretty much any time there's some kind of a large economic crisis. All right. So we talked about that. We talked about the causes, and then I kind of brought it up to the 1932 election. Franklin Roosevelt was the Democratic candidate running against Herbert Hoover, who, really handled the Depression badly. I mentioned like the tariffs, trying to balance the budget, and he just was kind of out of it. He didn't understand like how average, normal working people lived, and so he didn't have a real good sense of that. Ran, really unpopular candidate. People used to pull their pocket out and show that there was nothing in it. It was empty, and they call that a Hoover flag. And homeless people would build shacks out of, stuff, cardboard and things like that they found thrown away. And they called those Hoovervilles. So he's a really unpopular guy. Roosevelt, Democratic candidate, pretty clearly he's going to win. Doesn't really say a lot during the campaign. Talked about creating a new deal for the American people, which will be important. We'll talk about that in a minute. Had this general idea of what he wanted to do. He referred to it as the 3 R's: relief, getting relief to people who are in deep need, people who don't have food or don't have a place to live, they're homeless or they're hungry. Recovery, which is like getting the businesses and the banks back to business, getting them reopened, factories and shops and things like that. And then reform, which is long-term, is fixing the problems that caused the Depression so it didn't happen again. And one of the things we'll see in a minute, for instance, is that Roosevelt immediately begins to deal with the banking sector and create some laws for banking in order to try to prevent what had happened in 1929 from happening again. So FDR became president, and in his inaugural address, he talked about the problems America was facing. 1/3 of people are out of work and they're homeless and they don't have clothing. And he uttered those famous words: the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, which is kind of like psychological, posturing, because the reality is there's a lot to fear. People are out of work, people are hungry, there are mental health issues. It's just a horrific situation. People are going to food lines, people don't have medical care, so it's just really horrific. So there's actually a lot of stuff to fear, more than just fear itself, whatever that meant. But Roosevelt was really good at comforting people, and he saw that really as kind of his primary role initially, to give people these ideas, some people may call them illusions, that things are going to get better, to give them a sense of hope. So, he was kind of calming Americans down in that regard, not whitewashing it and saying there's no such problem. I don't want to panic you, so I'm not going to tell you the truth. He didn't do anything like that. He was very candid, right? And these massive unemployment, people are hungry, people are starving, people are out of work, people are suffering, they're ill, they can't get help. But he said, we'll take care of it. We'll work in this together and we'll get it done. Was his attitude. So he was inaugurated in early 1933 and then began fairly rapidly engaging in a bunch of new reforms that we refer to as the New Deal. Roosevelt's historical reputation, I said this the other day, was that he was kind of a liberal or a lefty or a radical or a socialist or whatever. What Roosevelt did at a level that hadn't been done before was involve the government in creating programs to help people out. Normally, when there were economic issues, the government didn't do a whole lot. Now, I've said before, and it's true, that the government is deeply involved in capitalism, but generally that means for businesses or for banks or for corporations. So if you have a massive economic problem and people are out of work or they're hungry or whatever, the government generally doesn't do much, doesn't do anything really with that. Because remember when I mentioned Hoover, one of the things he did very late was create a government program, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. But even then, that was a government program for business so that they could borrow money and allegedly use it to reopen their corporations, or their factories, their banks, or their businesses, or whatever. And it didn't really work out that well. It became, critics said, a breadline for big business. So people go to a bread line and get like a bowl of soup and a piece of bread, whereas businesses go to the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and get many, many millions of dollars. So there's clearly a difference then in the way that the state addresses economic crises, right? And Roosevelt's going to switch on that. That will be different, but it's not immediate. In fact, Roosevelt's first attempt to fix the Depression, which we call the first New Deal, was actually very conservative, and it was oriented toward business. And this fits in to something we've already talked about at least 2 or 3 times, right? That reform in America often comes from the top down. It's done in the interest of businesses. We talked about that in the progressive era. Remember with the story, for instance, of the jungle, where all these meat packers were, selling bad meat, and it was damaging the entire American meat packing industry. Upton Sinclair wrote a book about it, and then, the government took action. Well, at the same time, big meat packers were demanding that reform be done as well. And that was the point behind, for instance, the trade associations with Herbert Hoover. And that's what Roosevelt's going to do too, right? He's going to address the Depression as a problem of production. And if I was in class, I'd be going back and forth. What is the Depression? It is a problem of production. The problem of the Depression is a problem of production, according to Roosevelt in 1933. And that's important. Now, what's that mean? Roosevelt believed that the problem of the Depression was that the people who produced goods, the people who made stuff, the factories, the farms, weren't getting enough in return. So they needed to be helped. So the problem of the Depression was a problem of production, meant to FDR that you addressed the problem of a national, actually global, but in the United States, a national economic depression through helping producers, through helping businesses, through helping banks. So he's going to address it from the top down, right? Now, what this will mean is that he's going to engage in programs, create programs and engage in policies that enable these producers, these factories, these corporations, these banks, to kind of work together to restrict production and raise prices. That's the basic idea behind it. And some of you, your head's probably already whirling and saying, hey, wait a minute, that sounds weird. Okay, so we'll get to that. Now, at the time, the economy had 3 major sectors, and that's somewhat different than today. The biggest was industrial. And American industry isn't like, doesn't dominate global industry like it used to. Agricultural, which was huge, and then banking. So the main 3 industries that had to be addressed, that were really kind of creating these massive economic problems, were industry, agriculture, and banking, right? And Roosevelt has programs for each of them. In each of these cases, they're going to be similar. In each of these cases, the government will get together and work with businesses to regulate the field. They'll create codes to make things, kind of more reasonable, more rational, more stable, right? Now, the first thing is that Congress passes the National Industrial Recovery Act. And the National Industrial Recovery Act created an agency, a government agency called the National Recovery Administration. All right, and this is the logo of it. Now, if you were part of the National Recovery Administration, you had this little like sticker in your window, right? And what did that do? Roosevelt believed that the problem of the Depression was a problem of production. So what the National Recovery Administration would do would get together, like the trade associations or like the Progressive Era Reform, they get together the people who are engaged, the companies that are engaged in a particular industry. It could be automakers, it could be steel makers or whatever. They get together and they're going to be dominated, as always, by the biggest producers, U.S. Steel, people like Carnegie, Rockefeller, Ford, and GM, right? They're going to dominate these industries because they are the biggest producers. And they get together in these industries and they determine how to address the problem of production, right? They want to make more money. They believe that the way to make more money is to produce fewer goods, to make less stuff, but be able to charge more for it, right? So that's what Roosevelt's first approach is, to limit production and thereby increase prices. So if you make fewer cars, you can charge more for them. And so you get the automakers together in this National Recovery Administration group, and GM and Ford are going to say, okay, this is how many cars we're going to make. And obviously GM and Ford will get a bigger chunk of that, right? And so the smaller competitors are going to be in trouble. And so reform, remember, is almost always used by big companies to damage smaller companies in that particular field. So like Home Depot and Lowe's have way more power than your neighborhood hardware store, or Starbucks obviously has more power than your little neighborhood coffee shop, right? So it's about that. So that's what the National Recovery Act does. It creates these programs and it creates these codes. So all businesses now have to meet these codes in order to kind of be part of this government program and to follow these laws. So let me give you an example, which sounds kind of silly, but I think it illustrates it really well. So the National Recovery Administration had a group of people who, among other things, made brooms. And they created codes, they created regulations for broom makers. And they decided that brooms had to be, a certain width, a certain circumference, and a certain length, right? And certain, they regulated closely how a broom had to be made and what it had to look like, the dimensions and all that kind of stuff. So what's the big deal? All right, at the time, there were a lot of different people making brooms, right? Now, if you create codes, a lot of those companies weren't making these brooms in those regulation sizes now. So what happens to them, right? A lot of them are going to just quit making brooms, or they would have to get new equipment or refit it, which would cost money that they probably don't have, right? So by using these government agencies, to create codes under the National Recovery Administration, companies that had more resources, that were bigger, that were more profitable or wealthier, were able to dominate like a broom industry, right? Light bulbs. Light bulbs now, are very heavily regulated, right? You go to a store, there's certain wattage, and now they have to be, a certain type of, lifespan and things like that, right? But that wasn't really necessarily the case. You could just kind of make light bulbs, right? And there were a certain number of, you couldn't make like an infinite number of light bulbs. But what the NRA did, for instance, was create new codes on how light bulbs need to be made. And that obviously would help a company like General Electric, which is bigger and it's wealthier and, isn't going to have any problem meeting these new codes. So those are just a couple of examples, and there are tons of them. And as always, read the book, read those sections in the book. So the National Recovery Administration then attempted to address the problem of the Depression by limiting production, making it harder to produce more goods in certain cases, like, changing the size that you're allowed to make a broomstick out of, right? And giving power and priority to the biggest producers in a particular field. Like I said before, kind of like U.S. Steel and Standard Oil and Ford and GM and companies like that, right? So they want to reduce production and thereby increase prices. That's Roosevelt's first approach. This is not radical. There's nothing left about it. It's not liberal. It's corporate liberal, which we talked about before, and don't worry about that phrase. But it's certainly not radical. It's a very conservative idea. It's a very pro-business idea. We're going to let you fix the economy, all right? Now, that was the industrial program, the National Recovery Act. In agriculture, he created a program called the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Act. Now, again, according to Roosevelt and his people, the problem of the Depression is a problem of production. They're making too much. You have overproduction. You're producing too many goods. When you produce too many goods, prices are too low, and you're just not selling enough stuff to make money off of it. So they want to limit production. So in the case of AAA, the government does a couple things. It creates programs directly attached to production, and it also begins to pay farmers in order to help them, kind of weather this crisis, right? So the Agricultural Adjustment Act first tries to address the problem through production. And what does that mean? The government wants farmers to produce fewer commodities, less stuff, right? So they create, for instance, a hog reduction program, right? The government paid these farmers to slaughter pigs. So many, many millions of pigs were slaughtered and just buried, right? In order to keep the market down, right? They figured, okay, if we have fewer pigs, then pork and bacon won't be as available. There won't be as much pork and bacon on the market, which means they can charge more for it, right? If you lower production, if you slaughter pigs, if you just, kill them and bury them, then there will be less pork on the market, which means you can charge a higher price for it, right? Same thing with milk. So a lot of companies in the Depression in the 1930s were dumping milk. So millions, many, many, many millions of gallons of milk were being dumped in that period, right? And just to kind of show you again, like how some things are very relevant historically, this is a scene from 2020, from earlier this year, when COVID first hit and the economy.
Having dry skin is a struggle.
So you can look at that, but dairy farmers were dumping millions of gallons of milk again, right? So one way, this is supposed to be, right, this free market system and everything, but the government is very clearly controlling production in these particular cases. You're only allowed to make so much of this, and it has to be this particular size, or you have to slaughter these hogs, or you have to, dump all this milk. And the idea behind all these things is to keep production down, because there's been overproduction and there's too much stuff being sold. So if you, it's like supply and demand, right? If you decrease supply, then demand will probably go up. That's the idea behind it, right? If you make less stuff, if you produce fewer things, then the demand will go up. The consumption of it will go up, right? So that's one way they do it. Another way with agriculture that they do it is they create, for the first time, a major government subsidies program. You've probably heard that word before, subsidies. And we talk again about capitalism and the free market, and you succeed or you don't based on your own merits, and whether you win or lose is up to you. The reality is, though, again, the government steps in and clearly takes sides. It creates programs now where it will encourage farmers to raise less livestock or grow fewer crops by offering them money to not do that, right? They're going to subsidize them. They're going to give them money so that they don't go under, they don't go broke, but they're not going to have to do what they normally would do. They're not going to have to produce the stuff they normally would produce. So these are subsidies, right? In order to keep the market decreased, right? So you get paid for not doing something. I've been asking UH to do that for 20 years, right? Pay me not to teach, right? So these subsidy programs are important too. And generally, who gets these subsidies? Bigger farmers. The biggest agricultural corporations, often connected to the Democratic Party, because FDR was a Democrat, got big subsidies. So they're getting paid to not grow crops. They're getting paid to not raise livestock now. So on one hand, this is clearly going to reduce production, right, and raise prices. It also affects a lot of people working. Remember after the Civil War, how I said, a lot of ex-slaves became sharecroppers. Well, as a sharecropper, you're not a paid employee. So quite often when these companies are reducing production or getting subsidies, they release all their labor. They just get rid of them. And so many hundreds of thousands of small farmers and sharecroppers lost their livelihoods because of the Agricultural Adjustment Act. So if anything, it may have made the crisis in agriculture even worse. Now, in both of these cases, and I suspect some of you are saying this, I know you are because I get this in class all the time, people are saying, but wait a minute, you just said that people are homeless and they're dumpster diving and they're looking for food in garbage cans. So why are they destroying, like slaughtering hogs and dumping milk? Good question, right? The problem of the Depression as a problem of production, the way FDR saw it, said that you reduce production, you reduce supply, therefore you increase demand, you increase and you raise prices. But there's obviously a very clear problem in that, one that you don't need a PhD in economics to understand. People don't have money, so it's kind of hard to be a consumer when massive numbers of people, a third or more, are unemployed, where people are homeless, where people are ill and they can't get treated, where people don't know where their next meal is coming from. So this idea that the Depression can be fixed by producing less stuff, by making less stuff, and thereby increasing prices, doesn't make sense, right? It makes sense theoretically, but in real terms, it didn't work, right? Now, I also mentioned the banking industry is another key component. So in agriculture, you have the National Recovery Administration. I'm sorry, for industry, you have the National Recovery Administration. Agriculture, you have the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And then Roosevelt decides to do something about banking too. He actually does two things. And I don't have the other one up here, unfortunately. But so one of the first things Roosevelt did when he became president is get Congress to pass something called the Glass-Steagall Act. And it's in the book, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But what the Glass-Steagall Act did was separate commercial and investment banking. Remember when I talked about that with regard to the Depression? You could go into a bank, you could open up a checking account, a savings account, you could get a car loan, and you could buy stocks. And problematic because a lot of these banks were heavily invested in the stock market. And when the market crashed, these banks went under, which meant that people lost their savings, right? So Roosevelt, actually did a couple things. He got Congress to pass the Glass-Steagall Act, and they also created the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, the FDIC, so that most of your bank account will be protected, right? I don't know what it is up to now. It's like $200,000 or something like that, I think. And I don't know if anybody has that much money in a bank account. But the point is, if you're a small investor, or your life savings, it's safe now. So you have the government insures these bank deposits for average people, and it created the Glass-Steagall Act, which said that you can no longer do both commercial and investment banking at the same place, right? So that's going to diminish the amount of speculation that's possible. The Glass-Steagall Act was repealed by Bill Clinton in 1999, and that's one of the reasons we've had a lot of banking crises since then, but I'm not going to get into that. What Roosevelt does then is address this banking problem, insures banking deposits for average people, says that banks can no longer just have everything in one place. Like now you go online to one of these trading companies, and you can do all that in one place. You can open up an account, you can buy stocks, you can get a debit card, you can get a new pair of shoes, you can get your hat cleaned, all kinds of stuff like that, right? In one spot, one-stop shopping. But that wasn't the case then. And it also enables these big Wall Street banks, and you know where this is going, right? The SEC is going to regulate the industry now, right? The investment industry. It's going to regulate trading. It's going to go after people who are, engaging in insider trading. They're using secrets in order to trade. It's going to go after people who violate, finance laws and things like that. What it's going to do is kind of protect Wall Street banks against other banks, because whenever you have a government bureaucracy, it's not there to just do everything the same for everybody. They work for some people more than they work for others. And in the case of the SEC is there to make sure that Wall Street remains stable, because there's been a mass of bank closures from 1929 to 1933. So the Securities and Exchange Commission is there to try to regulate the industry, to make sure people are kind of doing it the right way, and also to protect Wall Street banks against smaller banks. All right. So that's the first New Deal. It's conservative, it's pro-business, doesn't really work all that well, because by limiting production, you have fewer things on the market. Prices do go up, but the problem is that basically people don't have enough to buy the stuff they need. They don't have the money to buy the stuff they need. So you can deal with all your economic theory you want, but if you don't have enough to buy the stuff you need, it's not going to really matter. And that was clearly the case in the first New Deal. Right now, if you're interested, Roosevelt, there's a ton of stuff. There's all kinds of New Deal programs. If you're interested in looking, you can click on that. So 1933, Roosevelt became president. 1933 and 1934, you have these programs go into effect: the National Recovery Administration, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the SEC is created. But it's not really doing much. The depression is still very deep. There's still a huge number of people who are out of work. There's still people who are hungry. There's still people who don't have medical care. The Dust Bowl is terrible. So you have this man-made environmental catastrophe, just like we have today with, things like global warming and wildfires and all that kind of stuff. So things aren't going well. And this is going to lead to an attack on Roosevelt, but from the left. Now, this is where, something new, right? Most attacks on Roosevelt came from the right. They hated him. They called him a Bolshevik and all kinds of crazy stuff like that. He was nothing of the sort. Roosevelt came from a very wealthy background. His goal, and he made this clear, just like Barack Obama did in 2008, his goal was to save capitalism because it was in crisis by 1933. Right? There were two major alternatives to capitalism in Europe, right? In the 1930s. In the Soviet, you had communism, and then in Italy and Germany, you had a different form of capitalism, corporatism, fascism, whatever. We'll talk about that later. Roosevelt doesn't want either of those. Roosevelt's not a communist. He's not a Bolshevik. He's nothing of the sort. And even though fascism is closer to capitalism, Roosevelt doesn't believe in that either. And he certainly doesn't have those kinds of political ideas like, putting people in prisons or shutting down newspapers or anything like that. Nothing like that happens under FDR. So it's not that kind of fascist political system, nothing of the sort, right? However, the programs, it's funny because when Roosevelt announced the NRA and the Agricultural Adjustment Act in the 1933, a lot of people immediately pointed out that was really similar to the kind of things that the Germans were doing, right? They were creating kind of programs like this too, where the government and businesses would get together and create economic policy. So you'd have a government and all the automakers, or the government and all the construction companies, or the government and all the steel makers, or the government and all the dairy farmers, or whatever. And they would get together and corporatism make economic programs, right? And so a lot of people were saying, hey, and nobody at this in 1933, no one understands that Hitler, what he's going to become, right? So a lot of people are saying, well, what they're doing in the US and Germany is really similar. Now, the person who was president before FDR, Herbert Hoover, when Roosevelt created the National Recovery Administration, Hoover called Roosevelt not a communist, but in fact, a fascist. This went further than the trade associations by creating all these codes and things like that. And Hoover thought that this was crazy, that the government should not have this much influence over business. But they're saying that Roosevelt's coming from the right. He's creating a fascist program, not a communist one at all. So when the criticism really hits, because the right wing always hated him, when the criticism really hits in 1934, 1935, it's coming from the left. And what does that mean? The left today is it's not at all what the left would have been not that long ago. People, newspapers and media, and always go on about the radical left and this and that. And I can assure you, Joe Biden is and Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party is far from radical left. All right, you don't really have radical left in America. The furthest left you have, among mainstream politicians would be somebody like Bernie Sanders or AOC, who are pretty liberal. All right. But in the 1930s, you had lefties. You had people who were socialists, people who were communists, people who were anarchists, people who talked about the problems of American capitalism and class and wanted serious action taken. Right? Now, there's a couple different layers of that. One is cultural, and the other is more political. Whenever you talk about American resistance or American opposition or American protest, culture has a lot to do with it because those are kind of the images of it, right? We often see more recently, someone like Colin Kaepernick, a football player, who really created this massive national discussion on police brutality, police violence, right? Currently, the NBA is doing that. So it's more cultural. You have, musicians like the Chicks, formerly the Dixie Chicks, who have been part of this movement. And you have, all kinds of musicians writing songs that are protest, songs about, whatever happens to be going on. If you ever see a documentary about like the civil rights movement, music is really important in that. So cultural resistance is important. Cultural resistance is often the first line. This is often how people find out about problems and get politicized, all right? So in the 1930s, there was a significant amount of that. The most famous entertainer of the 30s was Woody Guthrie. I think I've brought his name up before. Really famous guy, probably the most famous folk singer in American history. He and Bob Dylan probably are the two most famous Americans involved in kind of political music or protest music. I don't know if there's any question about that. So Woody Guthrie never joined the Communist Party, but he was very active. He wrote for communist newspapers. He did cartoons. He wrote articles for them. He wrote a lot of songs about politics that were really kind of hardcore. He wrote about bankers. He wrote a song about Jesus Christ. And in his version, it was the cops and the lawyers. I'm sorry, the cops and the bankers that put Jesus on the cross. They laid Jesus Christ in his grave, right? The cops and the bankers did, right? He wrote a song about Pretty Boy Floyd, who was a criminal, a bank robber, right? A bad guy. And Woody Guthrie turned him into kind of a national hero. Pretty Boy Floyd would go, as he was on the lam, he was on the run from bank robberies, he would go to strangers' houses and, they'd give him a meal and he'd leave him hundreds of dollars. So he became kind of a Robin Hood kind of figure. And Woody Guthrie said, as through this life you ramble, as through this life you roam, you'll never see an outlaw drive a stranger from his home. Meaning, unlike those bankers who kick people out of their houses all the time, Pretty Boy Floyd wouldn't do that. And then he says the last stanza is, through this life I travel, you'll meet some funny men. Some will rob you with a 6-gun and some with a fountain pen. Again, going after bankers and lawyers and people like that. This is maybe the most famous image of Woody Guthrie, which has been making the rounds quite a bit in the last few years. On his guitar, he had that written, "This machine kills fascists." And so there's been a renaissance of that lately. You've seen like T-shirts and posters and things with this picture of Woody Guthrie. And about a month ago, somebody put one out with a post office box that said, "This machine kills fascists," which comes straight out of Woody Guthrie, right? So Woody Guthrie was a really popular entertainer, and Americans listened to him. And a lot of Americans, not just learned about things, but understood, okay, this is part of the discourse, right? When you can have these people very publicly criticizing the United States or criticizing the government, then it kind of makes it easier for other people to do that. Like today, not everybody, a lot of people watch late night comedians make fun of Trump and things like that. So it creates this kind of cultural idea behind it. So Woody Guthrie is really important in that. One of the most important movies covering that period, made a little toward the end of the decade, but really important, was The Grapes of Wrath. And John Steinbeck. If you haven't read it, you really should. There's also a movie worth watching, but you should read it, which is it would be even better. But if not, watch it. It talked about people who were dislodged from their homes by the Depression and the dust storms. In this particular case, a lot of people in like places like Oklahoma and Arkansas just fled. They had to leave. They had nothing. Their farms were destroyed. The environment was destroyed. They had no money. So many of them would pack up their trucks and head out to the West Coast. They'd go to California. And actually, the Woody Guthrie video, which I'm not going to play here, talks about that too.
You want to see some action?
Is about people who are fleeing like agricultural areas to go to California. If you don't have the do-re-mi, if you don't have the cash, then you got to leave, right? And so Grapes of Wrath talked about the Joad family, which was in Oklahoma and had to leave. And there's a little clip here that I want to play. And again, it gets to that issue of bankers and who people blame and the idea of kind of a real left. So this isn't like a liberal left. This is a hardcore left that says we have an economic problem. Capitalism is failing, right? You had people openly calling themselves radicals. Socialists and communists were running for office. People, openly hated bankers. So this is a scene from Grapes of Wrath. The Joad family's lost his farm and they have to leave. And a guy pulls up in a car and
back to the matter, Muley. After what them dusters done to the land, the tenant system don't work no more. They don't even break even, much less show a profit. Why, one man on a tractor can handle 12 or 14 of these places. You just pay him a wage and take all the crop.
Yeah, but we couldn't do on any less than what our share is now. Well, the children ain't getting enough to eat as it is. And they're so ragged. We'd be ashamed if everybody else's children wasn't the same way.
I can't help that. All I know is I got my orders. They told me to tell you to get off, and that's what I'm telling you.
You mean get off my own land?
Now, don't go to blaming me. It ain't my fault.
Whose fault is it?
You know who owns the land, the Shawnee Land and Cattle Company.
And who's the Shawnee Land and Cattle Company?
It ain't nobody. It's a company.
They got a president, ain't they? They got somebody who knows what a shotgun's for, ain't they?
Oh, son, it ain't his fault because the bank tells him what to do.
All right. Where's the bank?
Tulsa. What's the use of picking on him? He ain't nothing but the manager. And he's half crazy himself trying to keep up with his orders from the east.
Then who do we shoot?
Brother, I don't know. If I did, I'd tell you. I just don't know who's to blame.
I'm right here to tell you, mister, there ain't nobody gonna push me off my land. My grandpa took up this land 70 years ago. My pa was born here. We was all born on it. And some of us was killed on it. And some of us died on it.
All right, that's a really famous scene from The Grapes of Wrath. There's one toward the end, very famous speech. Henry Fonda, who played Tom Joad, talks about, kind of how we're all connected together. This movie's definitely worth seeing too. You should read it as well. But that scene is really striking, right? Because the guy comes in and he's displacing this family from land they've held their whole lives. And, it's owned by the Shawnee Land and Cattle Company, and they're calling in the note. And, the guy says, well, who's that? Who do we shoot? And they said, no, it's actually a bank in Tulsa. But what's really interesting is that, like, in popular culture, in a movie, the theme is like, we want to shoot bankers, right? It's kind of like Pretty Boy Floyd, right? You'll meet some funny men. Some will rob you with a 6-gun and some with a fountain pen. So they're talking about the same people. There's this sense that bankers have betrayed us. They've violated Americans. Typical American doesn't have the chance against these big Wall Street companies. And so, there's got to be somebody there who knows what a shotgun is good for, according to that scene, right, in The Grapes of Wrath. So there's this striking, very powerful left, probably more so than really at pretty much any comparable time in U.S. history. We're seeing kind of some revitalization of that, more recently. But in the 1930s, you had, people, kind of the most famous entertainer of the day, was a guy named Will Rogers. He was kind of a comedian, kind of a Stephen Colbert, Jon Stewart kind of guy. He'd go around the country. They didn't have TV shows. They didn't have late night talk shows. So he'd go around the country and he would do shows. He would perform. He would do rope tricks and kind of adapt his persona as a cowboy, but had a lot of really hardcore anti-government satire, and a lot of his jokes were at the expense of the kinds of things capitalism and Americans were doing, right? He once said, he was talking about how the United States was always sending troops abroad to take over other countries. And he said, he was shocked. He said, I was shocked the other day. I actually saw a couple Marines on American soil, right? Because the Marines were always, in Latin America overthrowing, Haiti or Nicaragua or Mexico or whatever. So very biting, very satirical stuff. And this was really popular throughout the country, this kind of left critique, right? A governor of Minnesota said, I'm not a liberal, I'm a radical. So a lot of people were saying this system of private business, this capitalist system isn't working. It's not going well. We're in this catastrophic situation. And the stuff Roosevelt's doing hasn't really worked very well so far, right? So that's kind of the beginning, is this cultural resistance. But then I think more importantly, it really manifests itself politically too. So this idea that Roosevelt is being attacked from the left was called thunder on the left. It was a term devised by a very famous historian named Charles Beard, meaning that Roosevelt is being attacked from the left, right? Which is unusual. It's unique in American history, right? Because there's never been that much of a left in the United States. But in the 1930s, it was significant. And remember, these people probably voted for FDR in 1932 because, he said, I'm going to help you out, and I'm going to give you a new deal and all that kind of stuff. And what's he do? As soon as he becomes president, he takes care of these corporations, these banks, and all these other companies. So that leads to a great deal of criticism, much of it from the left. Probably the most important is somebody we've already talked about. Upton Sinclair is still around. Upton Sinclair, after, he wrote The Jungle, it became very well known. He remained a socialist, and he later moved to California. And in California, he created an organization called EPIC, End Poverty in California. It's an acronym, right? And he decided to run for the governorship of California in 1934. Sinclair believed that the state, in this particular case, the state of California, had a major role to play in helping people out. He believed that the state should take over factories that had been closed down, should take over farms that had gone, fallow, that people weren't growing crops on, that the state should take it over and turn it over to people so that they could use it, production for use. So they could have, create a factory, turn over a factory to workers who could make, furniture and lamps, stuff like that they could live with, turn farms over to people who could farm them and grow crops. So that's the idea behind it. It would be state ownership of the means of production. That's not capitalism, right? The state doesn't take these things over, right? That's not how it's supposed to be done. So Upton Sinclair and EPIC were very popular. Many, many millions of people signed up to be on like his, pamphlet list and things like that. They would, follow his Twitter feed, and they'd be Facebook friends and, all that kind of stuff. They loved his Instagram memes and all that, right? So Sinclair decided to run for governor on this program of ending poverty in California by, the state actually taking a really significant involvement in the economy and on behalf of working people, not just on behalf of the big corporations or the banks, but actually putting people to work, right? The Democrats, Upton Sinclair ran as a Democrat. Franklin Roosevelt was a Democrat. The Democrats hated Sinclair. They worked against him. He won the Democratic primary to run against the Republican, and the California Democrats supported the Republican, or they didn't support Sinclair at all, to make sure he was defeated. But Roosevelt's not an idiot. He doesn't just see something and pretend it didn't happen. Roosevelt never claimed that things were fake news or anything like that. He understood that Sinclair was very real, and that many, many millions of people supported Upton Sinclair. So, he's aware of that there are people out there who are not happy because of his pro-business approaches, right? Another guy was Francis Townsend. Francis Townsend was a doctor whose main issue was that older people didn't have good medical treatment. They didn't have good medical care. They really couldn't survive unless they saved money while they were working. And a lot of people didn't make anywhere near enough money to save for a retirement, or they went and lived with their kids. So Townsend came up with the idea of pension clubs, right? He believed that there should be a national pension system. His idea was that, people would, contribute to this pension fund, and then when they retired, they would get money every month, but they had to spend the entire amount every month. They had to spend 100% of it. Why do you do that? To force economic activity, to keep the economy going, right? You force people to spend money, all right? Millions of people joined these pension clubs or wanted information on them, right? So very well known. And again, Roosevelt is aware of that. He knows that this idea of pensions is important. He understands that poor people and old people voted for him in 1932, and now they're kind of getting upset, right? Another guy was John Lewis, who was the union president of the United Mine Workers, unskilled labor who wanted to form unions. Most unions, I said this before, were skilled workers, not unskilled workers. So industrial workers like steel workers or coal miners generally were not unionized. John Lewis, and they voted for Roosevelt because Roosevelt said he'd help them. But by 1934, 1935, Lewis is fed up because the situation with workers, the conditions of workers, hasn't really gotten much better either. So he turns on FDR, all right? But along with Sinclair, the most famous was Huey Long. Huey Long was a senator from Louisiana, very famous family, a real character, big guy, dressed funny, but he was a champion of people, right? He created a program, how Sinclair had EPIC, End Poverty in California, the government would take over these things. Huey Long created one called Share Our Wealth. Now just listen, that phrase says a lot, right? Share our wealth. Sharing wealth, that's not the American way, right? And I'm going to play a speech, about 3 or 4 minutes. This is a Huey Long speech. Huey Long was going to run for president again, FDR, but he was assassinated in 1935, I think. But he was running on a program that Roosevelt had not done enough for average people, that Roosevelt was taking care of businesses, and he was taking care of banks, and he was taking care of corporations, but he wasn't doing anything for working class people, people who were unemployed, people who were out of their homes, people who had medical issues, the rich people had everything and working class people were really kind of out in the cold. And so this is one of the last speeches he gave, and just listen to it because, you could give this exact same speech today, the numbers would be a little different and it would make sense.
At Aspen Dental, smile for zero money down with zero worries. Plus pay zero interest if paid in full.
According to the tables which we have assembled, it is our estimate that 4% of the American people own 85% of the wealth of America, and that over 70% of the people of America don't own enough to pay the debts that they owe. How many men ever went to a barbecue and would let one man take off the table what's intended for 9/10 of the people to eat? The only way you'll ever be able to feed the balance of the people is to make that man come back and bring back some of that grub he ain't got no business with. Now, how are you going to feed the balance of the people? What's Morgan and Baruch and Rockefeller and Mellon going to do with all that grub? They can't eat it. They can't wear the clothes. They can't live in the houses. Give them a yacht. Give them a palace. Send them to Reno and give them a new wife when they want it. If that's what they want. But when they've got everything on the God's living earth that they can eat and they can wear and they can live in, and all that their children can live in and wear and eat and all their children's children can use, then we got to call Mr. Morgan and Mr. Mellon and Mr. Rockefeller back and say, come back here. Put that stuff back on this table here that you took away from here, that you don't need. Leave something else for the American people to consume. And that's the program. We're not going to destroy the Gulf Refining Company. We're not going to destroy the Standard Oil Company. But we're going to say that the limit of any one man's stock ownership in the Standard Oil Company is from $3 to $5 million to that individual, and that the balance of the people of America own the balance of what the Standard Oil Company is worth. All right. Then we start from the bottom, that the 25 or more million American families shall have a homestead, a home, and the comforts of a home, including an automobile and a radio, the things it takes in that house to live on. We say to America, 125 million, none shall be too big, none shall be too poor, none shall work too much, none shall be idle. No luxurious mansions empty, none walking the streets, none impoverished, none in pestilence, none in want, but in the land blessed by the smile of the Creator, with everything to be consumed, to be eaten, to be worn, that America will become a land sharing the fruits of the land, not for the favored few, not to satisfy greed, but that all may live in a land in which the Lord has provided an abundance sufficient for the luxury and convenience of the people in general, I think.
All right, that's pretty remarkable. 1935 speech, right? He says 4% of the people own 85% of the wealth. Numbers that are pretty similar to that today. 70% of Americans are in debt. Again, numbers are very similar to that today. The median wealth for Americans is $30,000. That means half people are above it, half are below it. $30,000 is not a lot of money, right? So Huey Long was describing a situation very much like one that we're familiar with. And what's he want to do? Well, he, again, takes a very clear, unapologetic class approach to this, right? He says, these rich people, they're taking too much. They go to the picnic, they go to the barbecue, they take all the food, and, there's none left for anybody else. That's the kind of metaphor he uses. He wants to limit stock ownership to $5 million, a significant amount of money at the day, but even if you adjust it, nowhere near what we have today. I mean, the immense wealth that people have today was unimaginable in the 1930s. You know, people were worth $100 billions. People like, you know, Bezos and Gates and Elon Musk and Zuckerberg and people like that, unimaginable at the time. So that $5 million stock ownership today was nothing, right? But back then it was like, that's a lot of money, right? So he believes in that. He said these people have enough mansions, they have enough, you know, of everything, so they can share it. Again, we're talking about, you know, essentially Robin Hood, right? Taking from people who have it and providing for people who don't. So, you know, what's he say? So people should be guaranteed a homestead, a home. They should be guaranteed an auto. They should be guaranteed a radio. No one should be too big. No one should be too poor. No one should have to work too hard. No one should be idle. No one should be impoverished. So it is a class-based approach in the Share Our Wealth programs. He even came up with he wrote it along with the band director at LSU, a theme song for his Share Our Wealth program. One of the slogans he often used was "Every man a king," and so he actually had a.
And now, the corporate element of this state that were cheek for Joe, hand in hand with them, who profited by it, who ransacked this state for the element of their allies, are being told what they can do and what they can't do, what they will pay, what they can't keep from paying for the welfare of the people of Louisiana, and we expect to have this state ruled by the people and not by the Lord and the interest of high finance.
Every man a king, every girl a queen, for you can be a millionaire. But there's something belonging to others. There's enough for all people to share. When it's sunny June and December too, or in the winter time or spring, there'll be peace without end, every neighbor a friend, with every man a king.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Think you got a good band.
All right, so again, I mean, just listen to the language of that. Every man a king really kind of creates this sense, right? But, you know, the song is, but there's something belonging to others. There's enough for all people to share, right? Again, share our wealth, sharing stuff is belonging to others, but we can all have part of it ourselves. So this is a really radical notion. And again, Roosevelt's a smart guy. Franklin Roosevelt, you know, doesn't say, oh, these, you know, we can ignore these people, it's fake news, nothing like that. He knows that Sinclair and Townsend and Lewis and Huey Long all have many, many millions of followers. There are a lot of people who are upset, not that Roosevelt, you know, hasn't taken care of corporations, but he's done too much that way, that he's given industry and big farmers and way too much power, and that the idea of like slaughtering hogs and dumping milk while people are starving is you know, crazy, right? So that thunder on the left gets to FDR, and he understands he's got to run for president in 1935. Until he was assassinated, there was a good chance Huey Long would have run against him, which would have been, you know, incumbent presidents generally don't lose, but Huey Long was very popular too, so it wouldn't have been good for FDR. So what he did was take action. He actually listened to these critics, and he began to move in a different direction, because the first New Deal, which was conservative and pro-business firm, didn't work. So Roosevelt then created new programs, which we refer to as the Second New Deal. The motive for the Second New Deal tended to be these leftists, this thunder on the left. Now, the Second New Deal, for the first time, addressed the problem of the Depression as a problem of consumption. You know, when I talked about the first New Deal a few minutes ago, I said the problem of the Depression, as Roosevelt saw it, was a problem of production. There were too many goods being produced, which meant that there was overproduction, which meant prices were lower. People weren't making enough money. So what Roosevelt tried to do initially with NRA and AA and things like that was reduce production, make fewer cars, less steel, put codes in effect on the size of broomsticks and light bulbs, slaughter pigs, slaughter hogs, slaughter chickens, dump milk, you know, whatever. Get rid of stuff so that there's not as much, so that the supply isn't as great, which means that the prices can go up. Well, that didn't work for obvious reasons, right? Country's in a mass economic depression, so raising prices is probably, you know, not going to work very well, and clearly didn't. So what Roosevelt does, he listens to these critics. He understands that people are unhappy. The Depression is moved a little bit, nothing significant, right? So he comes up with new programs that deal with the Depression now as a problem of consumption, which is what it was. The problem of the Depression was a problem of consumption, a problem of demand. Very simply, in the simplest form possible, that meant that people didn't have money to buy the stuff they needed. That's what economies are based on. We can have all kinds of theories and math and charts and graphs and all kinds of stuff like that. At the end of the day, you can pretty much determine an economy by whether people are living, let alone living well, right? So if you don't have enough to buy the stuff you need, and that stuff includes things like food and housing and healthcare, then you have a real problem on your hands. And clearly by 1935, the situation was still really grave and really dire. And so the second New Deal addresses these problems that his critics like Sinclair and Long and Townsend and all these folks and Woody Guthrie and Steinbeck and the Grapes of Wrath, they address all of these issues in order to try to actually make life better for people who are suffering the most. So Roosevelt, in the second New Deal, created a whole new series of programs in which the most important element of it was that in which the US government took on the role of creating jobs. In fact, to be at its most base level, they created employment. Right? This is an idea based on the economic theories of a guy named John Maynard Keynes. Pretty sure I mentioned him the other day, and I'll mention him again. Keynes was a very influential British economist. He was the head of the Reparations Committee at Versailles. And at the time, remember I said when the Depression hit, Roosevelt wanted to balance the budget. Hoover wanted to balance the budget. That's what you did. You always kept the balanced budget, right? The basic idea, you don't want to be in debt, right? And today we have, $22 trillion of debt, but the idea there is you don't want to be in debt. Nobody wants to be in debt, right? So you keep a balanced budget. Well, Keynes said, forget it. Who cares? Like, the role of the government ought to be to spend as much money as it needs to create employment. It needs to create jobs. And if you run a deficit, who cares? Because ultimately you'll get it back. If you create a job, you give a guy $1, but that person, that man or woman, is going to get that $1 for a job the government created and then spend money, spend money at a store, purchasing food, buy tools, and then the people who, the food stores and the hardware stores are going to make money they're going to put in orders to suppliers and they're going to make money and so on and so on. And so Keynes said, in the short term, yeah, you'll run a deficit, but eventually it'll filter through the economy, called a multiplier effect. So every dollar spent ends up kind of having I forget what it was, $7 or $8 of economic activity attached to it. So who cares if there's a deficit? Roosevelt never was a Keynesian, but Roosevelt did address the Depression in the second New Deal by saying, okay, if we have to, we'll do that. And so you had a series of programs now that are very different than the first New Deal, right? Probably the most famous, because it's still around today and it's still, really important today, is Social Security. Roosevelt was aware of Francis Townsend's, pension club idea. So he created a system for old people called Social Security, right? What it does is, is you put money into an account, and then when you retire, or if somebody's disabled, or somebody, if you're, dies, if your spouse or parent die, you get a stipend based on what you put into it, right? So the Social Security system was created then to give people a sense of security, right? Now, from an economic standpoint, was it useful in helping the Depression? Actually, no, because how is Social Security funded? It's a tax, right? It's a tax on both employers and workers, right? So, recently when Trump said he was going to get rid of the payroll tax, what he meant was he wants to get rid of Social Security, right? Because that's how it comes about. So people actually, it was not a big tax, it's a small tax, but people actually got less money in their paychecks because of Social Security. But it's probably the most popular program in US history. Okay, why is that? First of all, everybody's involved in it. Everybody's included in Social Security. Most programs are for people who are poor, actually. A lot of government programs are just for people who don't, you have to, meet certain standards. You have to qualify for them. Social Security is not like that. Everybody's in it. And it gave people a sense of security. It gave them a sense that, this government was trying to make things better, because the only way Social Security is really going to be useful is if the government, if the country stays alive. If the country absolutely falls apart, if everything just is destroyed, then it won't matter, right? So Social Security gave everybody a sense of, kind of security, a sense of confidence. They believed that they had a share in the system, that everybody had to make it better, right? So that's one thing that's really important, the Social Security system, which is still around today. Because of the criticism coming from people like John Lewis, who wanted workers organized, who wanted workers to organize unions, and also from people like Sinclair and Long, who were really popular among workers, Congress passed the Wagner Act, also known as the National Labor Relations Act. For the first time, the US government said that it would enable workers, it would help workers join unions, form unions and join unions. The government had always been strongly anti-union, right? Sends out, troops to break strikes and so on. But the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act, said that's not going to be the case anymore. Workers should be allowed to form unions. So the National Labor Relations Act created the National Labor Relations Board. It's still around today. So before, if you had a complaint about your workplace, you would talk to the foreman, you'd talk to your boss, and you'd say, I don't like this, or I want more money, or you're making me work too much overtime and not paying me, whatever. It's not safe here. Generally, you would have to go tell your boss that, and you might very well be fired, but not likely that anything was going to come of it. If you wanted to form a union, you'd have a vote in front of everybody, and the bosses would be there, and they'd be intimidating people not to join a union, and they'd be pressuring them, but they'd be firing people who were trying to organize a union. So the National Labor Relations Board, the US government, now comes in and takes over that process. So people sign a card confidentially that they turn over to the NLRB saying, yeah, we want to have a vote on a union. And then that vote is conducted by the NLRB, and it's a private vote, secret ballot. And if they choose to have a union, then the government certifies that union. And then if you have a problem, you go through National Labor Relations Board regulations. So if you have a problem with your boss, if he's cheating you out of overtime or whatever, unsafe working conditions, you file a grievance now, and the National Labor Relations Board will come in and arbitrate it. So, it used to be the boss would handle. I got a problem with you, the boss would say, well, we're not going to fix it, goodbye. So now that doesn't happen. So that's a big deal. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on how well it works and how much Roosevelt was really committed to labor. There's a ton of stuff in the book on that, a ton of stuff, because it's important, right? But the reality is it was clearly a gesture designed to make workers feel better, to make workers feel more confident that they could form a union, and to get back the reputation that Roosevelt had with labor, all right? So the Wagner Act is really important. Probably the most important government program of its type was the WPA, or the Works Progress Administration. In this particular case, the government actually took on the responsibility of creating jobs. It set aside hundreds of millions of dollars to create a public works program, right? So the government, not private businesses, the government said, we are going to pay people to go do things. So the WPA is put into effect. The government pays people to build post offices, to create a lot of national parks. The Civilian Conservation Corps, which was part of the New Deal program, also put people to work doing that, creating parks and cleaning rivers and things like that. To build post offices, to build airfields. The WPA had artist programs, so people were actually subsidized. Jackson Pollock, a very famous artist, got his start in WPA. Orson Welles, a very famous actor and screenwriter, got his start in WPA. All right. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to play a video, kind of bring us toward the end. It was a propaganda film. Basically, the U.S. government put it out, and it was actually directed at African Americans, because when the Depression hit, Blacks were hit even harder, because obviously they're sharecroppers. They're still living with these vestiges of slavery, especially in southern areas. They're poorer. They're often, with the Agricultural Adjustment Act, many of them are just let go as sharecroppers. So the WPA wanted to make a point of saying, hey, look at how we're helping African Americans. But beyond that, the programs that they describe here are very typical of WPA programs. So you get a sense of what the government did and why it's kind of a real shift, all right?
I'm asking you to make a donation right now to have your gift triple matched and help us.
There we go. Wondered what happened there. Sorry about that.
Only a few years ago, we were a discouraged people because we were the first to lose our jobs when Old Man Depression came along and the last to get them back. We struggled vainly to regain our bearings while depression, fear, and failure stalked the nation. A tenth of the population of the United States, we formed as a race over a sixth of the unemployed. 1 out of every 4 of us was on relief. In vain, we sought for something to restore our confidence, our hope, our courage. Without jobs, we had no money. And without money, we could not purchase food for the hungry at home. Our only hope lay in charity. Hunger drove our people to the bread lines. Anxiously, we waited for some sign of better days. Then came the federal government's work program. One by one, it took us out of the bread line. It gave us a new chance to take a normal place in the life of our community. It made us self-supporting. It changed the haggard, hopeless faces of the bread line into faces filled with hope and happiness, for now we work again. Unskilled laborers, the forgotten men of past generations, now work steadily at decent wages. The nation over, they're building and repairing schools, public buildings, community centers, and airports to meet the changing needs of our modern world. In one project at the nation's capital, 1,200 men are employed in improving bowling fields, grading, constructing runways, building hangars, and administration buildings. In addition to the hundreds of unskilled laborers who were removed from relief roles, many skilled workers are employed in this important improvement project. Hundreds of homes have been freed from the bondage of poverty as their breadwinners find security and hope in their new jobs. In New York City, a WPA housing demolition project is underway, which will greatly improve the living conditions of families of moderate means. In many other cities of the country, old tenements and fire traps are being torn down to make way for modern buildings containing comfortable sanitary apartments. At Colonial Park in Harlem, as in many other congested areas, WPA workers have constructed a huge swimming pool and are now completing a bathhouse which will accommodate 4,100 persons. In this construction project, skilled workers are employed, utilizing the knowledge of their trades gained in the days before depression. Swimming pools are particularly valuable to the community because they offer a haven of relaxation to young and old during the hot summer months. Crowded city streets, providing every safeguard to prevent such tragedies as were all too common to the old swimming holes. Typical of the park improvement projects underway all over the country is another feature of the improvement program at Colonial Park. A wading pool has been built by WPA workers in which the youngsters may splash to their heart's content. New additions to the playground area have been made possible by the grading and improvement of parts of the park which were formerly merely decorative. Even the youngest children find plenty of opportunities for play under watchful supervision. In many parts of the country, nursery schools have been established where almost 10,000 children of our needy families are provided with hot meals, supervised play activities, and excellent preschool training under competent instructors removed from relief roles. In these projects, employment has been provided for 600 teachers, nurses, dietitians, and cooks. At the other extreme of age, more than 300,000 adults have learned to read and write for the first time in their lives. Eagerly they study, realizing how very much a little knowledge can mean in our modern workaday life. Teachers drawn from relief roles instruct them in useful subjects such as arithmetic and foreign languages. In Harlem, where a large part of the population is from Puerto Rico and Central and South America, a knowledge of Spanish is valuable to workers, shopkeepers, and others. In this class, elementary instruction in the spoken language is given by native teachers. In cooperation with the National Youth Administration, 26,500 young men and women are employed as instructors, laboratory assistants, and clerical helpers. Thus, they are enabled to continue their education.
All right. That's a good description of what the WPA did. Built schools, it built housing and apartments, which were actually then basically used, restricted to white people. One of the major issues in kind of systemic racism in the United States is housing, and this kind of real big expansion of public housing in the Depression and World War II era is a major factor in that, because most of that housing, almost all that housing, was reserved for white families, and it's through owning a house and building up equity in that you get savings that you can often pass on to your children. So these housing projects, even though they, as the video showed, kind of created jobs for African Americans, actually were a major cause of segregation and poverty and racism in the United States. But they built housing, they built apartments, airports, public buildings, post offices. They had permits for arts and music. They showed you that scene from in the park in New York, where they built parks, they built swimming pools, bathhouses, spas. They had an adult ed program, nurses, cooks, teachers, English as a second language, typing, literature, math, all that kind of stuff. So this is this big, massive, kind of amazing government program where the government actually puts the money in to creating these jobs, right? Conservatives, as you can imagine, utterly hate it. It's just the worst thing ever to them, right? Why? What's the problem with public money? This is public money. Whenever you talk about the government, we talk about public money, right? What's the problem? Why is public money bad as far as these people are concerned? Really simple idea. Because public money isn't private money, right? Duh, right? But if it's public money, that means that private money isn't going into it, which means they're not investing in it. They're not profiting from it. So when the government creates jobs, then they see the government as kind of a competitor. And so in the United States, government action to kind of create employment has never been terribly popular. There have been periods like in the 1960s, there were government programs during a period called the Great Society. In the late 70s, there was a program called CETA, the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act. So they do occur. I'm not suggesting they've never been there, but they're not terribly popular. And especially, conservatives, especially, and people involved in business hate them because they believe that all investment, all businesses should be private, not public, right? So they're willing to let the public pay for a football stadium or give them a subsidy to run their business, but that's cool. So, the debt can be socialized. The debt can be public, in terms of who builds it, who builds a stadium or who gives a subsidy. That can be public money. But the private is profit. I'm sorry, the profit is private, right? And so that's clearly one of the biggest arguments against the WPA and programs like it, that the government is putting this money in, thereby depriving private investors of an outlet. And so there's a real hatred for this, but it works. I mean, you start to see economic improvement in sorry about that. You start to see improvements in the economy. There we go. I had to exit the screen. Escape didn't work. the number of people unemployed goes down, the unemployment rate goes down. People are working now, so they're making money. I mentioned earlier the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was dealt with things like the environment. Civilian Conservation Corps tended to be for younger men, and I think you were paid something like $22 a month, but you were required to send either all or almost all of that money back to your family. The idea is that's one way to get money into places all over the country. You know, young men joined the CCC from all over the United States, and then they were given this money and told that they had to send it home. So people all over the country were starting to get money, which they would use to buy stuff. So again, it deals with the problem of the Depression as a problem of consumption. It subsidizes consumption. It gets money into the hands of people through jobs, through programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the WPA. It creates jobs, it creates employment, which means people get paid, they get wages, and then they can buy things. So by 1936 and 1937, you start to see the economy get better. People are optimistic. The unemployment rate was down somewhere in the 13% or so range, 12, 13%. More people are working, right? But boom, it stopped pretty much on a dime in 1937. Why? Because according to Keynes, this is the way you're supposed to be done. There was a huge deficit. The government was spending hundreds of millions of dollars without getting anything back in return, right? It's putting these money into programs to build parks and swimming pools and things like that. So it's not getting anything in return. So it's running a massive deficit. The debts are going up and up. Roosevelt said, you know what? We can't have this kind of deficit. We need to balance the budget. And so even though these programs tended to be working, they were putting people to work, people were getting money, they were getting jobs, they were getting wages, they were spending money. Roosevelt cut significantly most of the WPA programs. So, you know, these people stopped working. Some projects were shut down, halfway done. So all of this government money that had been, you know, facilitating this recovery is kind of yanked back out because the budget was not balanced. And so in 1937, unemployment went up again to somewhere close to 20%. Fewer people were working, and you started to see kind of the conditions that had existed earlier, which seemed to be getting better in 1935, 1936, and 1937. Those problems start to return because of this. So Roosevelt kind of mucked up the whole recovery by not being Keynesian, by believing that he couldn't run deficits, by believing that the government was spending too much money. All right. And so, you know, the first New Deal, he was very conservative. The second New Deal, he listened to his critics, engaged in some programs that seemed to be working, and then kind of pulled them out. Now, the Depression will end, and that's largely because of World War II. And we'll pick that up on the next class. This was lecture number 9. Again, do all the reading, read everything, check Blackboard for all the information on testing and extra credit and stuff like that. Contact the TAs if you have any questions about that stuff, you know, about extra credit training and extra credit, about the test. They're the ones who grade it. You know, if you have any generic questions on the class, talk to any of us. If you've had any book questions, contact Nunn McGinney. We'll see you again soon, and you know, stay on top of things, watch the videos, do all the reading, and you know, take care of yourselves and be safe. Thanks.